I am Julian. I am 32 years old, and for a solid decade of my life, I was not treated like a son. I was treated like a human bank account. My entire existence was reduced to a signature on a check, a convenient safety net for people who never once asked if I was drowning. This completely toxic dynamic reached its absolute breaking point on a Tuesday night in late October. I was sitting at my parents' dining room table, exhausted after a 14-hour workday, when they ambushed me. They slid a cream-colored envelope across the polished mahogany table and demanded I pay $275,000 for my younger brother Tristan's upcoming luxury wedding. When I refused, the masks completely fell off. My mother slammed her hand on the table, her face twisted with a level of rage I had never seen. "If you will not support this family, then leave and do not come back," she screamed. My father nodded, standing up to physically intimidate me, yelling that I was a selfish disgrace. They were humiliating me, disowning me, throwing me away like garbage right in front of Tristan, who just sat there taking a slow sip of his expensive red wine, smiling like he had won the lottery. But there was one massive, life-altering secret they did not know. 8 years ago, my father thought he was incredibly smart. He tricked me into signing a stack of legal documents he claimed were just routine tax paperwork. He did not realize that by trying to cover up his own financial crimes, he had accidentally transferred the entire title of their $4.2 million estate directly into my name. They were threatening to kick me out of a family, completely unaware that I was about to legally kick them out of my house. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled their perfect little lies and exposed their massive real estate fraud to the entire world, hit that like button if you believe that karma always comes to collect. And please, drop a comment down below letting me know where you are watching from today. I read every single one. Now, let's go back to that suffocating dining room where my family completely destroyed their own future. The drive to my parents' house in Westchester that evening felt unusually heavy. It was raining, that cold, miserable New York autumn rain that seeps right into your bones. My mother, Helen, had called my office assistant 3 times that morning, demanding I show up for a mandatory family dinner. She framed it as a cozy catch-up session. She told me she was making my favorite roasted rosemary chicken. I should have known it was a trap. In the Parker family, a cozy dinner was never just a dinner. It was a tactical strike. It was a boardroom meeting where I was the only one who didn't get a copy of the agenda. I pulled my modest sedan into the massive circular driveway of their colonial estate. The house was a sprawling, immaculate property sitting on 2 acres of manicured lawns. My father, Victor, was the neighborhood tyrant. He was the guy who ran the local HOA meetings with an iron fist, threatening to fine neighbors if their grass was a 1/4 of an inch too high. He projected this image of massive generational wealth. He wanted everyone to believe we were American royalty. I unlocked the front door and walked into the grand foyer. The house smelled of expensive candles and the roasted chicken my mother had promised. I walked into the formal dining room, still wearing my work suit, my briefcase heavy in my hand. My father sat at the head of the long mahogany table. He was wearing a crisp button-down shirt, nursing a glass of scotch. My brother, Tristan, sat to his right. Tristan was 28, perfectly groomed, wearing a designer cashmere sweater that I had technically paid for last Christmas. Tristan was the undisputed golden child. He was charming, he was handsome, and he was completely, terrifyingly allergic to hard work. I was the workhorse. I was the guy who worked with numbers in the city. We made small talk through the appetizers. It was agonizingly fake. My father complained about his golf handicap and the incompetent contractors working on the country club's new patio. My mother talked about her upcoming wine-tasting trip to Napa Valley with her society friends. Tristan talked about his beautiful fiancée, Clara, and how her parents were buying them a summer home. Nobody asked me how my day was. Nobody asked me about my career. I was just an audience member in their theater of success. Then, right as the main course plates were cleared away by the housekeeper, the atmosphere in the room shifted violently. The casual smiles dropped. The trap snapped shut. My father reached into his leather briefcase sitting on the floor next to him. He pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope, heavy with high-grade stationery. He placed his large hand flat on top of it and slid it across the polished wood table toward me. "Open it, Julian," he said, his voice dropping an octave into his authoritative, corporate tone. "We have some very important family business to discuss." I picked up the envelope. I broke the wax seal. Inside was a meticulously detailed spreadsheet and a massive stack of vendor contracts. At the very top of the spreadsheet, highlighted in bold black ink, was the grand total, $275,000. I scanned the itemized list. It was the budget for Tristan's upcoming New Year's Eve wedding. It included a rental fee for the Rainbow Room in Manhattan. It included $45,000 for imported floral arrangements. It included a $20,000 open bar tab, a custom designer gown for Clara, and a first-class honeymoon to the Maldives. I looked up, genuinely confused. I assumed he wanted me to review the contracts for legal liability. I handled complex financial acquisitions for a living. I assumed he wanted my professional opinion on how badly they were getting ripped off. "The venue costs look incredibly inflated," I said calmly, setting the papers down. "And this floral budget is completely absurd. You could use this money for a down payment on a solid piece of real estate instead of burning it on a 6-hour party." My father let out a sharp, condescending laugh. It was the kind of laugh meant to make you feel like you were 3 years old. "I am not asking for your financial advice, Julian. I am giving you your payment schedule. You need to wire the first $60,000 by Friday to secure the Rainbow Room deposit." The room went dead silent. The only sound was the rain hitting the large bay windows. I stared at him, waiting for the punchline. I waited for Tristan to laugh and say it was a joke. There was no punchline. My mother leaned forward, folding her hands neatly on the table. "Tristan deserves a beautiful day," she said. Her voice was dripping with that fake, sweet, manipulative tone she used when she wanted to completely steamroll someone. "Clara's family is very prominent, Julian. We cannot look like peasants in front of them. You have plenty of money sitting around in your accounts doing absolutely nothing. It is time you stepped up and did your part for your brother." I looked over at Tristan. He took a sip of his wine, perfectly relaxed. He did not even have the decency to ask me for the money himself. He just let our parents act as his personal debt collectors. "I am not paying for this," I said. My voice was steady. "Absolutely not." My father's face turned bright red. The veins in his neck began to bulge against his collar. He slammed his fist down on the table, making the crystal water glasses jump and clatter. "You selfish ingrate," he barked. "You are a disgrace to this family. Your brother is getting married, and you will pay for it. Every single penny. Family supports family. That is how this works." "Family supports family?" I fired back, my own anger finally rising to the surface. "I have been supporting this family for a decade. I paid Tristan's rent for 3 years. I bailed him out of his credit card debt. I funded his failed startup. The bank is officially closed, Dad. He is 28 years old. He needs to pay for his own wedding." That was when my mother delivered the fatal blow. Her eyes turned ice cold. The fake sweetness vanished entirely. She pointed a manicured finger directly at the front door. "If you will not support this family, then leave and do not come back," she hissed. "Do not call us. Do not show up for Thanksgiving. We will not have a selfish, greedy monster sitting at our table. You are entirely cut off until you learn what loyalty means." They expected me to break. They expected me to panic at the thought of losing my family. 10 years ago, when I was desperate for their validation, I would have begged for forgiveness. I would have drained my savings account just to see my mother smile at me. But 10 years in the ruthless world of corporate finance had fundamentally changed my DNA. I felt my heartbeat slow down. The desperation evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp, brilliant clarity. I stood up. I picked up my coat. I looked my father dead in the eye, and then I looked at my mother. "You have 24 hours, I said. My voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried across the room like a gunshot. My mother scoffed, crossing her arms. 24 hours for what? To write the check. No, I replied, staring right through her. 24 hours to figure out your next move. Because you just made a very big mistake. I turned around and walked out the front door. I did not look back. I walked out into the freezing rain, got into my car, and locked the doors. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. My own parents, my own flesh and blood. They were perfectly willing to throw me away like a broken tool the second I stopped dispensing cash. I pulled out my phone and dialed the one person I trusted more than anyone else in the world. My lawyer, Desmond. Desmond was a shark. He was brilliant, ruthless, and intensely loyal. He picked up on the second ring. It was past 9 at night, but he knew I never called unless the building was on fire. Desmond, I said, my voice shaking slightly from the adrenaline. I need you to pull the property records for my parents' estate in Westchester. Pull everything from 2016. The deeds, the transfer history, the tax records, the liability clauses. Everything. I want it on my desk by tomorrow morning. My family thought they were bullying a helpless bank account. They thought they held all the power. They had no idea the files sitting in the county clerk's office were about to turn their entire reality into an inescapable legal nightmare. To truly understand the absolute insanity of that dinner, you have to understand the historical dynamic of the Parker family. I was always the workhorse. Tristan was the show pony. And my parents were the ringmasters who made sure the workhorse stayed in the mud while the show pony got all the applause. When I was 22 years old, I landed my first junior analyst job at a major financial firm in Manhattan. I worked 80-hour weeks. I slept on a hand-me-down mattress in a tiny apartment with 3 roommates in Queens. I ate instant noodles for dinner, skipped lunches, and saved every spare dollar to build an emergency fund. I was terrified of being poor. I was terrified of failure. I did not have a massive college fund waiting for me. My parents had quietly drained my college savings years prior to fund a major renovation on the Westchester house. They told me I could take out student loans because it would build my character. That same year, Tristan decided that attending his sophomore year of college was just too stressful for his mental health. He announced he wanted to take a gap year to travel across Europe to find himself. My parents thought this was a brilliant display of intellectual curiosity. They threw a lavish farewell dinner for him. At that dinner, my father pulled me aside into the hallway. He guilt-tripped me about my new corporate salary. He told me I was living comfortably in the city while my brother was trying to broaden his cultural horizons on a tight budget. He demanded I contribute to Tristan's travel fund. I was 22, exhausted, and desperate for my father to look at me with the same pride he looked at Tristan. Caved. I handed over my entire corporate signing bonus. Tristan spent the next 6 months posting photos from luxury yachts in Santorini, eating truffles in Florence, and skiing in the Swiss Alps. He did not find himself. He just found new ways to spend my money. When he finally returned to New York, claiming he was ready to join the workforce, my parents decided he needed a reliable vehicle to commute to his new entry-level marketing job. They bought him a brand new black Porsche. I remember visiting them for the holidays that year. I walked up the driveway and saw that gleaming, obnoxious Porsche sitting there. I was still taking the subway at 5 in the morning, standing shoulder to shoulder in the freezing cold, calculating whether I could afford to add meat to my groceries that week. When I asked my mother how they afforded a luxury sports car, she just waved her hand dismissively. She told me Tristan needed to project success in order to attract success. The financial demands never stopped. Over the next decade, I paid for Tristan's luxury apartment deposit. I bailed him out when he racked up credit card debt buying designer watches. Meanwhile, my father, Victor, paraded around town as the chairman of the Westchester Charity Foundation. He hosted massive galas, rubbed shoulders with local politicians, and gave long, winded speeches about philanthropy. At those charity events, Victor would introduce Tristan to the wealthiest men in the room as a rising entrepreneur, a visionary. When he introduced me, he would simply pat my shoulder and say, "This is Julian. He works with numbers in the city." He made my career sound like I was doing data entry in a windowless basement. But what they did not know was that I was not just pushing papers. I was climbing a ladder they could not even comprehend. Early in my career, I caught the attention of a man named Winston. Winston was a former titan of Wall Street. He managed billions of dollars in assets, sat on multiple corporate boards, and commanded respect just by walking into a room. For some reason, he saw my relentless work ethic and took me under his wing. He became the father figure I desperately needed. One evening, we were sitting in a private cigar lounge downtown. I had just finished telling Winston a particularly humiliating story about my father taking credit for a small promotion I had earned. Winston took a slow draw from his cigar, looked at me through the smoke, and gave me a piece of advice that fundamentally changed my life. "Julian," he said, his voice gravelly and serious, "never let them see your full hand. The moment people like your father know your true net worth, they will try to claim credit for it. They will use guilt and obligation to bleed you dry. Build your empire in total silence. Let them think you are average. The best armor a wealthy man can wear is the illusion of an ordinary life." I took his words as absolute gospel. I quietly, ruthlessly worked my way up the corporate ranks. By the time I was 29, I was made a managing partner at Apex Capital. I was managing an emerging markets portfolio worth $850 million. I bought discrete commercial real estate. I maxed out my 401k. My salary and bonuses pushed my net worth into the high seven figures. But to my parents, I was just Julian who lived in a normal apartment and had a decent salary. I purposely drove a modest, 5-year-old sedan when I visited them in Westchester. I never wore my expensive tailored suits or luxury watches around them. I became a ghost in plain sight, but despite my financial fortress, there was one lingering mystery from my past that always bothered me. A dark spot in my memory from the winter of 2016. I had just closed a brutal, grueling corporate merger. I had not slept in 3 days. My brain was absolute mush. My father called me on a Thursday night and insisted I drive up to Westchester immediately. He said it was a massive legal emergency regarding his estate planning and tax optimization strategy. I walked into his home office completely exhausted, running on nothing but black coffee and pure adrenaline. My father had a massive stack of complex legal documents spread across his mahogany desk. My mother was standing by the door, wringing her hands nervously, pacing back and forth. My father handed me a heavy luxury pen. "I need you to sign these right now, Julian. It is just some routine property transfers. The government is changing the tax laws, and I need to shield the family estate from new liabilities. I have already filled everything out. Just sign where the yellow sticky notes are." I tried to read the top page. The legal jargon completely blurred together in front of my tired eyes. I asked him if we should have an independent lawyer look at the contracts. My father slammed his hand on the desk. He always used physical intimidation when he was challenged. "Do you trust your father or not?" he demanded, his voice echoing in the small room. "I have been managing real estate and corporate assets for 30 years. I am trying to protect your future inheritance. Just sign the damn papers so I can file them with the county tomorrow morning." I was too tired to fight him. I wanted to go home and sleep in my own bed. I trusted him. He was my father. I signed my name on 7 different pages, handed him the pen, and left. For 8 years, I thought I had just helped him navigate a minor tax loophole. I never thought about that night again. Until the morning after the ambush dinner. I was sitting in my corner office in Manhattan, staring out at the skyline, when my computer pinged. It was an email from Desmond. The subject line was written in all capital letters. "Read this immediately." I opened the encrypted attachment. It was a scanned, certified copy of a property deed from the Westchester County Clerk's office. I zoomed in on the document. The document was a transfer of ownership for 47 Woodland Drive, Westchester, New York. The purchase price was listed as $4.2 million. The seller was Victor Parker. The sole legal owner, buyer, and title holder was Julian Parker. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I picked up my cell phone and called Desmond. "Desmond, tell me I am misreading this. I said, my voice barely steady. You are not misreading a single word, Julian, Desmond replied. His voice was deadly serious, stripped of his usual sarcastic banter. Those were not estate planning documents you signed in 2016. Your father sold you his house 8 years ago. He transferred the entire title, the entire legal burden, straight into your name. How is that mathematically possible? I demanded. I did not pay him $4 million. Where did the money come from? Desmond let out a heavy sigh. I dug into the financial routing numbers attached to the deed. Julian, your father had massive, crippling gambling debts in 2016. He owed very dangerous people close to $3.8 million. He was about to lose everything. He leveraged the equity in the house, forged secondary loan documents using your stellar credit history, and essentially cashed out the value of the estate to save his own skin. He legally sold the house to you, pocketed the cash from the fraudulent bank loans, and paid off his bookies. I felt physically sick. The room started to spin. My own father had committed mortgage fraud using my name and my credit to cover his disgusting gambling addiction. He used me as a human shield against the consequences of his own actions. And there is more, Desmond continued, his tone turning sharp and clinical. Since you are the sole legal owner of the property on record, your parents have been living in your property as non-paying tenants for 8 years. Based on fair market rental value in that specific Westchester zip code, they owe you roughly $384,000 in unpaid back rent. I leaned back in my leather chair. The sheer scale of the betrayal washed over me like freezing water. For 8 years, they called me a selfish disappointment. For 8 years, they demanded I pay for Tristan's luxury life. And for 8 years, they were sleeping in a house that belonged entirely to me, rent-free, after stealing my credit identity to save my father from total ruin. My father had not just stolen from me. In his arrogance, in his desperation, he had handed me the absolute legal power to destroy him. They told me to leave their house. They didn't realize they were standing in mine. And the war had not even started. The psychological warfare began the very next morning. My family realized I had not wired the $60,000 deposit for the Rainbow Room, and their entitlement quickly mutated into pure panic. My phone buzzed relentlessly on my desk. First came the voicemails from my mother. She started with the classic textbook guilt trip she had used to control me since childhood. Julian, it is your mother, she said, her voice trembling with forced emotion. I have not slept all night. My chest is tight. Your father's blood pressure is dangerously high this morning. How can you do this to your own flesh and blood? Please just wire the money to the venue. Tristan is in tears. Clara's family is asking questions. Do not destroy your brother's happiness out of spite. When I did not respond to the tears, the tone shifted drastically. By noon, my father started sending aggressive, legally threatening emails to my personal account. He threatened to have his lawyer draft a formal lawsuit against me for breach of verbal contract. He claimed my sudden refusal to pay was causing severe emotional distress and reputational damage. It was utterly laughable. It was pathetic. He was threatening to sue me for money I didn't owe him, while actively living inside a house that I owned. Then came the call from Aunt Beatrice. Beatrice was my mother's older sister, and she was the ultimate secret manipulator of the family. She always played the sweet, concerned, deeply religious aunt, but she was the family gossip and the primary enforcer of my parents' toxic rules. If you stepped out of line, Beatrice was the one who called to shame you back into submission. I let her call go to voicemail, but I sat at my desk and listened to the recording. Julian, honey, it is Aunt Beatrice. I am just so terribly disappointed in you. Your parents are good, hardworking people. Your father works so hard for that charity foundation. You know he is going through a very stressful time with his finances right now. He needs cash fast, Julian. He is struggling, and you are being so stubborn and cruel. Just pay for the wedding. God watches everything we do, and he does not bless a selfish child. I paused the recording. I played the middle section back. He needs cash fast. He is struggling. Beatrice knew. She absolutely knew Victor was broke. That tiny slip of the tongue confirmed everything Desmond had found in the property records. My father's charity chairman persona was a total illusion. He was completely underwater. He was probably gambling again, burning through whatever credit he had left. Tristan's wedding was not just a celebration of love. It was a calculated, desperate attempt to marry Tristan into Clara's incredibly wealthy family to secure a financial lifeline for my parents. They were trying to use my money to buy Tristan a rich wife to save themselves. Later that afternoon, my receptionist walked into my office and handed me a thick, glossy envelope that had just arrived via private courier. It was a formal event invitation. The Westchester Charity Foundation was hosting its annual Platinum Gala in exactly 3 weeks at the Plaza Hotel. The theme printed in gold foil on the front was Family Values and Community Wealth. Inside the envelope was a handwritten note from the foundation's president, a woman named Margaret. "We are so thrilled to have you as our keynote speaker this year, Julian. Your father speaks so highly of your success. We cannot thank Apex Capital enough for the $250,000 platinum sponsorship." I stared at the note, a slow, dark smile spreading across my face. A month ago, my firm's charitable committee had brought me a list of massive year-end corporate donations for tax write-offs. I had skimmed the list and signed off on it without looking closely at the individual charities. Apex Capital had essentially funded my father's precious gala. The foundation's board of directors, seeing my name as the managing partner of Apex Capital, had demanded Victor invite me to speak. Victor had absolutely no choice. He had to invite the son he had just threatened to disown. He was trapped by his own massive ego and my company's money. I immediately drafted a polite, professional reply to Margaret, confirming my attendance and my keynote speech. I promised them a presentation on wealth management and family legacy that they would never, ever forget. But just as I was feeling totally in control of the chessboard, my assistant, Sarah, knocked frantically on my door. She looked highly concerned, her face pale. She was holding a fax document. "Julian, I just intercepted this from the accounting department," she said, handing me the paper. "It is a vendor contract from Fiona Designs. They are a high-end wedding planning agency in Manhattan. They are demanding immediate payment for a venue upgrade, a string quartet, and imported floral arrangements. The total is $45,000. They are threatening to send it to collections if we don't wire the funds by 5 p.m. I took the paper from her hands. It was a binding legal contract holding the signatory personally responsible for the massive debt. I scanned the itemized list, my blood boiling. I scrolled down to the bottom of the page. There, on the primary signature line, was my name, Julian Parker. But it was not my handwriting. It was a sloppy, frantic forgery. My blood ran completely cold. Tristan had forged my signature on a legal financial document. He committed felony fraud to get expensive imported roses for his wedding. He actually believed he could bind me to a massive debt, assuming I would just quietly pay it to avoid a public family scandal. He thought I was weak. He thought I was still the 22-year-old kid desperate for approval. "Sarah," I said, my voice dangerously calm, "scan this document immediately. Send it directly to Desmond's private email. Then block all incoming calls and emails from Fiona Designs. Tell accounting to flag any unauthorized charges hitting my personal or corporate accounts." An hour later, I was sitting in Desmond's sleek downtown law office. The view of the Manhattan skyline was stunning, but I was entirely focused on the glass conference table. We had the forged contract, the property deed from 2016, and the tax records spread out in front of us. "This changes the game, Julian. This escalates everything," Desmond said, tapping his expensive silver pen on the forged contract. "Tristan crossed the line from being an entitled, spoiled brat to committing a serious felony. If we turn this over to the police right now, he is looking at real prison time. Forgery for financial gain over $10,000 is a major offense." "I do not want the police involved yet," I said, leaning forward. "I want them to feel safe. I want them to think they have backed me into a corner. I want them to step onto the stage before I pull the trapdoor." Desmond leaned back in his chair, his eyes sharp and calculating. So what is the play? We have them dead to rights on mortgage fraud, unpaid rent, and forgery. I slid the glossy invitation to the Westchester Charity Gala across the glass table. My father is hosting his biggest event of the decade in 3 weeks. 400 of the wealthiest, most influential people in the state will be there. The local press will be there. The foundation's entire board of directors will be there. He is going to stand up and preach about family values. Desmond read the invitation. A slow, dangerous smile appeared on his face. You want to execute the eviction at the gala. Not just the eviction, I replied, feeling the ice in my veins. I want to execute everything. I want you to draft a formal 30-day notice to vacate the premises for Victor and Helen Parker. I want you to calculate every single dollar of unpaid rent with interest. Prepare a severe cease and desist order for Tristan regarding the forged contracts, outlining the criminal penalties for his actions. I want all the documents printed on heavy stock and bound in black leather folders. And I want you there with me, ready to serve them legally in front of every single person they spend their miserable lives trying to impress. Desmond nodded, opening his laptop, his fingers already flying across the keyboard. I will have it ready. We will make it legally airtight. There will be no loopholes. They won't be able to fight this in court. They wanted to play dirty. They wanted to use my name, forge my signature, steal my credit, and throw me out of my own family. But they forgot one crucial, undeniable rule of high-stakes finance and real estate. The house always wins. And legally, I owned the house. The 3 weeks leading up to the gala felt like the quiet, suffocating pressure right before a massive hurricane makes landfall. I cut off all direct contact with my parents and my brother. I blocked their cell phone numbers. I routed their emails straight to a hidden folder on my server. I went completely dark. But they did not stop trying to break my boundaries. They were like rats testing the walls of a cage. About a week before the event, I received a phone call from my cousin, Felix. Felix was a real estate agent in New Jersey who had always played the neutral peacemaker in the family. He sounded incredibly sympathetic and soft-spoken on the phone. Julian, man, I heard what happened at the dinner, Felix said smoothly. Uncle Victor is losing his mind over here. He says you are trying to ruin Tristan's life out of jealousy because Clara comes from old money. I told him I know that is not true. How are you holding up, man? You know you can talk to me. I knew exactly what Felix was doing. He was a spy. He wasn't calling to check on my mental health. Victor had sent him to gather intelligence, to probe my defenses, to see if I was going to cave and pay the money, or if I was planning some sort of retaliation. I decided to feed the rat. I sighed heavily into the phone, pitching my voice to sound exhausted and stressed. It has been really hard, Felix. I am just burying myself in work to ignore it. Actually, I am preparing a very special, heartfelt speech for the charity gala next week. I just want to clear the air about our family values and make things right. I think Dad will be surprised. I hung up, knowing exactly what would happen next. 10 minutes later, I checked the call logs on my private server. Felix had instantly dialed Victor's home phone. He ran right back to his master with the fake intel. Victor's reaction was entirely predictable. He was arrogant, but he was also deeply paranoid. He assumed my special speech meant I was going to get on stage and publicly cry about being mistreated. He thought I was going to throw an emotional tantrum and beg for their love in front of his wealthy friends. To counter this imaginary threat, I found out through the Foundation's event coordinator that Victor had quietly doubled the private security detail for the gala. He instructed the guards to stand near the stage and physically remove me from the building if I went off script. He thought he could control me with sheer physical intimidation. The night of the gala finally arrived. The air in New York was crisp and freezing, biting at my face as I stepped out of my apartment. I pulled up to the Plaza Hotel in a sleek, black town car. I stepped out wearing a custom-tailored, midnight blue Armani suit. My watch alone was worth more than Tristan's entire wedding floral budget. I did not look like the exhausted, overworked son they remembered. I looked exactly like the man who managed nearly $1 billion in assets. I looked like power. Desmond arrived a moment later, stepping out of his own car. He looked sharp in a classic charcoal suit, carrying a heavy, black leather briefcase. Inside that briefcase was the absolute, undeniable destruction of the Parker family. We walked into the grand ballroom of the plaza. It was a masterclass in superficial wealth and ridiculous excess. Crystal chandeliers dripped from the high ceilings, casting a warm, golden glow. Massive ice sculptures carved into the shape of the foundation's logo slowly melted on silver platters atop the buffet tables. Waiters in white gloves circulated through the crowd with trays of expensive champagne and caviar. Across the room, standing near the main stage, was my family. Victor looked like a king holding court in his expensive tuxedo. Helen was draped in diamonds that I now knew were likely purchased on predatory credit cards they could not afford to pay off. Tristan was standing next to his fiancée, Clara, laughing loudly and showing off his perfectly white teeth to a group of local politicians. I took a deep breath, centered myself, and walked straight toward them. Desmond shadowed me, completely silent and physically imposing. When Victor saw me approaching, his fake, camera-ready smile tightened into a rigid grimace. He excused himself from the politicians and stepped forward to intercept me before I could get too close to the VIP section. "Julian," he said, his voice a low, warning hiss that only I could hear. "You actually showed up. I hope you remember our conversation. If you try to embarrass this family tonight, if you try to pull a stunt, I will have security drag you out into the street. Do not test me." I smiled calmly, adjusting my expensive cufflinks. "I am just here to give my keynote speech, Father. Exactly like the foundation asked me to." Tristan walked over, Clara clinging to his arm, looking me up and down. He sneered at my suit, totally unaware of its actual value. "Still trying to play the big shot, Julian? Clara's parents are sitting at table 4. Do not go over there and ruin the mood with your jealousy. Just sit in the back and be quiet." I looked at Tristan. I thought about the forged $45,000 contract sitting in Desmond's briefcase. I thought about the felony he had committed. I just smiled, a cold, empty smile. "Enjoy your evening, Tristan. It is going to be a very memorable one." Suddenly, Theodore, a senior member of the foundation's board of directors, spotted me from across the room. Theodore was a heavyweight in the New York commercial real estate market, a billionaire. He pushed past Victor and extended both hands toward me, his face lighting up with genuine respect and excitement. "Julian Parker," Theodore boomed, shaking my hand vigorously, completely ignoring my father. I was absolutely thrilled when I saw Apex Capital on the platinum sponsor list. "The work you did on that commercial acquisition in Brooklyn last quarter was nothing short of brilliant. You saved my firm millions in liabilities." Victor looked like he had been struck by lightning. He stared at Theodore, completely confused, his jaw practically hitting the floor. "Theodore? You know my son's work." Theodore laughed loudly, slapping me on the back. "Know his work? Victor, your son is a legend in the emerging market sector. We all read his massive profile in the Financial Times last month. You kept quiet about having a financial genius in the family. You always just said he worked in an office doing data entry." Victor's face drained of all color. He looked at me, realizing for the very first time that the narrative he had built, the lie that I was a mediocre, struggling failure, was completely falling apart in front of his wealthiest peers. The illusion was breaking. I looked at my father. My eyes were dead and cold. I did not say a word to him. I did not need to. As the lights in the ballroom dimmed and a voice over the loudspeaker asked everyone to take their seats for the opening remarks, Victor stumbled as he walked up to the podium. He looked shaken, but his raging arrogance quickly took over again as the bright spotlight hit his face. He was perfectly confident that his lies would protect him. I took my seat at the front VIP table. I touched the cool leather of the presentation folder resting on the table in front of me. I glanced to my right at Desmond. Desmond gave me a single, confirming nod. It was time to step on the stage. It was time to burn his fake kingdom to the ground. Dinner was served precisely at 8 o'clock, and the entire production was meticulously designed to be an overwhelming, suffocating display of suburban royalty. The massive mahogany dining table, which could easily seat 40 people, was set with my mother's most expensive, imported fine china. Heavy crystal water goblets caught the light from the chandeliers, and antique silver cutlery sat weighty and ice-cold against the pristine white linen tablecloths. A small, highly coordinated army of hired catering staff in crisp white shirts and black silk ties moved silently and efficiently around the room. They poured vintage Cabernet Sauvignon into the waiting glasses of the elite guests, and served steaming plates of perfectly seared filet mignon paired with butter-poached lobster tail. It was exactly the kind of meal meant to intimidate. It was a calculated performance meant to remind every single politician, investor, and socialite sitting in that room of Harrison's sheer financial power and his seemingly untouchable social status in our affluent community. I was seated at the absolute farthest end of the table, entirely by my father's careful design. To my immediate left was the heavy wooden swinging door leading to the catering kitchen. The staff constantly rushed in and out, their elbows brushing past the back of my chair, treating me more like an obstacle than a guest. To my right sat a profoundly deaf, elderly woman who happened to be the mother of the city's chief zoning board commissioner. She spent the entire first course staring blankly at her lobster bisque, completely isolated from the conversation. I was geographically and socially isolated from the center of power. I was placed exactly where my father firmly believed I belonged in this world, on the absolute fringes of the family legacy, completely out of sight and out of mind, until the precise moment he needed to extract something from me. At the head of the table, my father was in his absolute, undeniable element. He was holding court, laughing loudly, projecting the flawless image of a benevolent, generous patriarch and a highly successful, self-made real estate tycoon. He was actively and aggressively working the room from his chair, ensuring that every corporate investor, every country club board member, and every local politician felt properly worshipped and validated. Directly to his right sat Preston, the undisputed golden child of the family. Preston was wearing a custom-tailored, midnight blue velvet dinner jacket that probably cost more than my very first car. He was speaking loudly, intentionally projecting from his diaphragm to make absolutely sure his voice carried over the ambient, polite noise of the crowded room. He was aggressively targeting Mr. Montgomery, the silver-haired real estate whale sitting just a few seats down the line. Preston was actively pitching him over dinner, throwing around complex industry buzzwords about commercial property yields, leveraging high-risk debt, and maximizing quarterly profit margins. The absolute key to surviving the current market fluctuation, Preston stated loudly, taking a long, deeply arrogant sip of his expensive aged scotch, is highly aggressive acquisition. You simply cannot be afraid of a little heavy leverage. That is exactly how my father and I built the family brand to what it is today. That is precisely how I plan to exponentially expand our corporate portfolio in the next fiscal quarter. You just have to possess the stomach to play the game with the big boys, take the massive risks, and secure the prime real estate. I watched Mr. Montgomery very closely from my quiet place at the end of the table. The older man was politely and methodically cutting his steak, nodding non-committally at Preston's boastful speech. But I knew Montgomery extremely well. I knew exactly how he operated behind the closed doors of corporate boardrooms in Manhattan. I could clearly see the slight, almost imperceptible tightening around the corners of his eyes, the micro-expressions of deep, polite boredom masking a subtle, growing irritation. Montgomery was a self-made, ruthless billionaire who deeply respected quiet, proven competence and absolutely despised loud, unearned arrogance. Preston was completely drowning in his own bottomless hubris, entirely unaware that the powerful man he was desperately trying to impress was actively analyzing his glaring financial insecurities. Every now and then, Montgomery's sharp, calculating eyes would flick down the long length of the table to my end. We didn't exchange any words. We didn't offer each other a single smile. But the silent, professional acknowledgement passing between us was deafening to me. He knew exactly why I was sitting in the corner like a banished servant, and he was simply waiting with immense patience to see exactly how this tragic play would unfold. As the catering staff seamlessly cleared the heavy dinner plates and began pouring fresh, bubbling champagne for the upcoming dessert course, the ambient noise in the dining room shifted noticeably. My father stood up slowly at the head of the table. He picked up his crystal champagne flute and tapped it gently, rhythmically with a heavy silver dessert spoon. The clear, sharp ringing cut through the polite chatter of 35 wealthy guests, which immediately died down to absolute silence. Faces turned respectfully toward Harrison, anticipating a heartwarming, traditional holiday toast. My mother, Margaret, leaned forward in her chair, her face plastered with a deeply practiced expression of adoring, unwavering devotion to her husband. Friends, esteemed colleagues, and distinguished guests, my father began, his voice warm, deep, and heavily practiced for maximum emotional impact. I want to personally and deeply thank each and every one of you for taking the time to join our family tonight in this beautiful home. Christmas is a profound time of reflection. It is a sacred time when we gather together to celebrate the fundamental things that truly matter in this chaotic world. Unwavering tradition, absolute loyalty, and the enduring, unbreakable strength of the family legacy. He paused perfectly, letting his weighty words hang in the warm air, allowing the captivated guests to nod in solemn, respectful agreement. As many of you in this room already know, Harrison continued, his tone taking on a sudden, somber, highly theatrical edge. We recently suffered a terrible loss. We lost the patriarch of our family, my beloved father, Theodore. He was a truly great man, a builder of communities, a man who fundamentally understood that a family's true strength lies entirely in its solid foundation, and that foundation must be fiercely protected and passed down through the proper, traditional channels to ensure the next generation thrives and prospers. I felt my stomach tighten into a hard, cold knot. Here it comes. The ambush was being laid out perfectly, step by calculated step, in front of a captive, highly influential audience. Unfortunately, my father said, letting out a heavy, manufactured sigh that echoed in the quiet room. In his final, tragic months on this earth, my father's once brilliant mind began to tragically and rapidly fail him. Age is a cruel, unforgiving thief. In his deep confusion and mental decline, he made some highly unusual, deeply concerning alterations to his estate and his final will. Alterations that go entirely against the core traditions and values he upheld his entire adult life. He drafted a deeply flawed document that would unnecessarily divide this family and fundamentally threaten the very real estate legacy he spent his entire life building from the ground up. A low, sympathetic murmur rippled through the well-dressed guests. A few people cast deeply sympathetic, pitying glances toward my father and my mother. Aunt Beatrice, sitting near the middle of the table draped in expensive jewelry, loudly whispered to the woman next to her. It is just such a horrific tragedy what severe dementia does to a person's brilliant mind. My father held up a steady hand, instantly silencing the whispers in the room. But, he said, his voice rising with a false, sickening nobility, a strong, resilient family immediately corrects its mistakes. A strong family stands completely united in the face of temporary confusion and legal errors. And tonight, surrounded by our dearest friends, we are going to correct that tragic mistake. We are going to ensure that the primary family estate remains exactly where it rightfully belongs, with the eldest son, to carry the family name and our business forward into the future. Suddenly, right on cue, my mother stood up from her chair. She walked quickly and purposefully to my father's private study, which was adjacent to the dining room. She returned a moment later holding a thick, cream-colored legal document and an incredibly expensive, gold-plated fountain pen. She didn't hand the items to my father. Instead, she walked the entire length of the long mahogany table, the eyes of 35 powerful people following her every single move, and stopped right next to my chair. She placed the heavy legal document directly over my empty dessert plate. The bold, black, undeniable letters glared up at me under the chandelier light. Voluntary relinquishment of inheritance rights. Julian, my father said, his voice carrying easily and commandingly across the dead silent room. He wasn't asking a question. He was issuing a direct, non-negotiable command. We all know how much you loved your grandfather. We all know you want what is absolutely best for the future of this family and our corporate standing. Do the right, honorable thing tonight. Sign the paper, formally relinquish the Cape Cod property to your brother where it belongs, and let us all enjoy our Christmas dessert in peace, as a united, unbreakable front. All 35 pairs of eyes shifted simultaneously from my father at the head of the table, all the way down to me sitting in the corner. The sheer social pressure in the room was physically crushing, like sitting at the bottom of the ocean. This was Harrison's absolute masterstroke. He was aggressively leveraging the immense, suffocating social weight of his entire country club network and his business partners. He was betting everything he had on the arrogant assumption that I would be entirely too embarrassed, too weak, and too terrified of making a public scene to refuse him. He genuinely thought I would quietly sign away a $2.8 million inheritance just to avoid ruining the dessert course for his wealthy friends. I looked down at the thick document. I looked at the gold fountain pen resting heavily on top of it. Then, I lifted my chin and looked down the long length of the table directly at Preston. My older brother was practically vibrating in his chair with unchecked greed, a smug, incredibly victorious smile creeping onto his flushed face. He thought he had already won the war. I slowly reached out and picked up the fountain pen. I held it between my fingers for a long, agonizing, silent second. The room held its collective breath. Then, I placed the pen gently back onto the wooden table, pushed the legal document firmly away from my plate, and looked my father dead in his eyes. "No," I said. My voice wasn't a shout, but in that silent, cavernous room, it carried like a ringing bell. "I am not signing a single thing, Harrison." Grandfather Theodore was in his right mind. He knew exactly what he was doing, and I will be keeping my house. A collective, highly audible gasp rippled violently through the dining room. Several society wives actually clutched their pearl necklaces in shock. The absolute, unmitigated audacity of a younger son publicly defying his powerful, wealthy father at a formal holiday dinner was completely scandalous in their world. The benevolent mask on my father's face shattered completely into a million pieces. The smiling patriarch vanished into thin air, replaced instantly by a vicious, cornered tyrant who had just been publicly humiliated in front of his investors. His face turned a deep, highly dangerous shade of purple. He threw his linen napkin violently onto the table, his heavy chair scraping loudly and aggressively against the hardwood floor. He marched down the entire length of the table with terrifying, unhinged speed. Before I could even push my chair back to stand up and defend myself, he was towering over me, blocking out the light from the chandelier. He reached down, grabbed my upper left arm, and dug his fingers into my flesh with unhinged, violent, desperate force. His manicured fingernails bit sharply through the expensive wool fabric of my tuxedo jacket, pinching the sensitive skin underneath until it burned. A sharp, radiating pain shot straight down to my elbow and up into my shoulder joint. He leaned down, putting his red, furious face mere inches from mine. His breath was hot, smelling heavily of the vintage Cabernet he had been drinking all night. "You listen to me, you ungrateful, pathetic little parasite," he growled, his voice a low, terrifying hiss meant only for my ears, but clearly audible to the guests sitting closest to us. "You will sign that legal document right now, or I swear to God, I will completely destroy your pathetic little life. I will ruin you in this town, I will ruin you in New York, and I will ensure you are left with absolutely nothing but the clothes on your back. You will do exactly as I say." The room was completely, utterly paralyzed. 35 highly influential, powerful adults sat frozen in their expensive chairs, watching a grown man physically assault his own son over a real estate dispute. Nobody said a single word. Nobody stood up to intervene or call for help. They just stared, complicit in their silence. I looked up at him, my heart pounding violently against my ribs, the physical pain in my arm flaring hot and sharp. I didn't break eye contact. I refused to let him see fear. "Let go of my arm," I said, my voice remarkably steady, though my adrenaline was spiking through the roof. "Sign the damn paper," he snarled, tightening his violent grip even further until I felt a deep bruise actively forming and spreading beneath his fingers. Then, the heavy wooden door leading to the catering kitchen swung open with a loud thud. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Harrison." The voice was incredibly calm, deeply resonant, and carried the absolute, unquestionable authority of a federal judge presiding over a courtroom. My father froze instantly. His grip on my arm loosened just a fraction of an inch, just enough for me to forcefully yank my arm out of his abusive grasp. I pushed my chair back hard and stood up, rubbing my bicep, where deep red crescent marks were already beginning to darken into purple bruises. Standing in the doorway, perfectly framed by the bright fluorescent lights of the catering kitchen, was Mr. Winston. He was wearing a flawlessly tailored, razor-sharp charcoal suit, holding a slim, black leather briefcase in his right hand. He looked entirely out of place in a suburban dining room, yet he somehow commanded the absolute attention of the entire space the very second he stepped foot in it. My father blinked rapidly, totally thrown off balance and disoriented by the sudden, commanding intrusion of a stranger in his secure home. "Who the hell are you?" Harrison demanded, trying to puff his chest back out and desperately regain control of his dining room. "This is a private family matter. You are trespassing on my property." Mr. Winston didn't blink. He didn't flinch. He walked slowly, deliberately, into the dining room, his expensive leather shoes making absolutely no sound on the hardwood floor. "My name is Arthur Winston," he said, his voice echoing powerfully in the dead silent room. "I am the senior founding partner of Winston and Associates in Manhattan, and what you just arrogantly referred to as a private family matter is legally defined in this state as assault, battery, and criminal coercion, committed in front of 35 distinct witnesses." The color completely and instantly drained from my father's face, leaving him looking like a ghost. I thought the worst was over. I was so incredibly wrong. The execution was just beginning. The silence that immediately followed Mr. Winston's cold, legal introduction was absolute and genuinely terrifying. You could have heard a single pin drop onto the thick Persian rug. The wealthy guests sitting around the massive mahogany table were completely paralyzed, their wide eyes darting frantically back and forth between my furious, red-faced father and the imposing, utterly calm presence of my boss. "Get out of my house immediately," my father spat, pointing a shaking finger toward the front door, though his voice completely lacked the absolute, terrifying conviction it had possessed just moments before. "You have absolutely no business being here. This is a private, invitation-only event. I will call the police." "Actually, Harrison, I highly suggest you do not call the authorities right now," Mr. Winston said smoothly, reaching a slow, deliberate hand into his tailored jacket pocket. He pulled out the thick, familiar cream-colored cardstock and tossed it casually onto the dining table. It landed with a soft thud right next to the silver gravy boat. "I possess a formal, written invitation. You explicitly sent it to my Manhattan office 3 weeks ago, desperately hoping to solicit my firm's substantial capital investments for your failing commercial real estate ventures. And given that I am also the primary, legally appointed executor of Theodore's binding estate, I considered it my strict professional duty to attend this little gathering." My father stared down at his own embossed invitation as if it were a highly venomous snake ready to strike. Aunt Beatrice, clutching her wine glass, let out a small, high-pitched gasp of sheer horror. Preston had gone completely, rigidly stiff by the fireplace, his grip on his heavy Scotch glass turning his knuckles stark white. Mr. Winston walked over to the side serving table, completely ignoring the stunned catering staff who had frozen with serving trays in their hands, and set his slim black leather briefcase down. The heavy, metallic click of the brass latches opening sounded exactly like a judge's gavel striking wood in the dead silent room. "You stood before your esteemed guests tonight and publicly, falsely claimed that your father, Theodore, was suffering from severe dementia," Winston said, pulling out a thick, heavily tabbed stack of medical files. You loudly claimed he was confused, senile, fundamentally incapable of making sound legal and financial decisions regarding his own $2.8 million property. He was completely senile, my mother shrieked suddenly, finally finding her voice. She stood up from her chair, pointing a violently shaking finger directly at me. Julian maliciously manipulated a sick, dying old man. He completely isolated him from us and forced him to change the will to steal from his own brother. Winston didn't even bother to look in my mother's direction. He simply held up the first certified document for the room to see. This, Winston announced, his voice carrying the immense weight of absolute, undeniable truth, is a comprehensive, independent neurological evaluation. It was conducted exactly 48 hours before Theodore signed his final will. It was personally performed by Dr. Aris, the esteemed chief of neurology at Massachusetts General Hospital. The medical conclusion is completely unambiguous. Theodore possessed full, flawless cognitive capacity, perfect memory retention, and complete executive function. He was mentally sharper at 89 years old than the vast majority of the people sitting in this room. Winston casually tossed the certified medical evaluation onto the dining table. It slid smoothly across the linen and came to a stop right in front of one of the local city councilmen, who immediately looked down at the official hospital letterhead, his eyes widening in shock. Furthermore, Winston continued, reaching back into the briefcase and pulling out a small, sleek digital tablet, Theodore knew exactly who you people were. He knew your character flaws intimately. He knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that you would attempt to illegally bully, coerce, and legally threaten Julian into surrendering what was rightfully his. So, to ensure there was absolutely no legal ambiguity in probate court, we recorded a high-definition video affidavit on the day of the signing. Winston tapped the screen of the tablet and turned it around, placing it carefully on the small wooden stand on the serving table. He quickly connected it via Bluetooth to the room's high-end surround sound system, the exact same expensive system that had been playing soft, elegant classical music just minutes before. Suddenly, my grandfather's voice boomed through the massive dining room. It wasn't the weak, frail, trembling voice of a dying man suffering from dementia. It was the strong, authoritative, deeply gravelly voice of the patriarch who had ruthlessly built the family real estate empire from absolutely nothing. If you are watching this specific recording, Theodore's recorded voice echoed off the walls, deep and entirely unwavering. It means I am dead, and my son Harrison has predictably attempted to illegally override my final wishes out of sheer, unadulterated greed and a pathetic need for control. My father physically recoiled, staggering backward half a step as if he had just been brutally slapped across the face by an invisible hand. My mother immediately covered her mouth with both of her hands, letting out a loud, muffled sob of total humiliation. I am leaving the Cape Cod estate in its entirety to my youngest grandson, Julian. The recording continued, Theodore's face stern and uncompromising on the screen. Not because he asked for it. Julian never asked me for a single dime his entire life. I am leaving it to him because he is the absolute only person in this bloodline who actually possesses a functioning moral compass. Harrison, you are a blind tyrant who values superficial appearances over the well-being of your own flesh and blood. Preston, you are a spoiled, arrogant, utterly incompetent fool who will rapidly squander everything you touch. Julian is the only one fit to carry my true legacy. If anyone in this family attempts to contest this will, they will face the full, devastating legal wrath of Arthur Winston and his firm. The audio cut out with a sharp click. The heavy silence returned to the room, thicker, heavier, and far more suffocating than before. Harrison was actively hyperventilating, his chest heaving aggressively under his expensive tuxedo shirt. He looked around the room at his captive guests in sheer panic. The local politicians, the corporate investors, the country club board members. They were all staring directly at him with a toxic mixture of profound shock, deep pity, and absolute, unmistakable disgust. The grand facade was completely, irreparably shattered. The benevolent, successful patriarch was dead. The abusive, greedy, manipulative tyrant was fully exposed under the bright chandelier lights for everyone to see. "This is completely ridiculous," Preston suddenly shouted, stepping aggressively away from the fireplace. His face was blotchy and red, his voice cracking violently with sheer panic. He pointed a trembling, accusatory finger directly at me. "He's still a lowly, pathetic paralegal. He can't even afford to pay the annual property taxes on a nearly $3 million estate. He doesn't even have a real career in the city. He's just going to immediately sell it and steal the cash for himself." Mr. Winston stopped packing his briefcase and turned slowly to look at Preston. The senior lawyer smiled, and it was without a doubt the most terrifying, predatory expression I had ever seen on a human face. "A paralegal?" Winston repeated slowly, letting the word roll around in his mouth like a deeply amusing, incredibly bad joke. He looked at me, raising an eyebrow, then looked back at Preston. "Is that really what he told you? Is that what you genuinely believe?" Winston turned his attention completely away from Preston and looked directly toward the high-backed leather armchair by the frosty bay window, where the silver-haired billionaire was sitting in absolute, stunned silence. "Mr. Montgomery," Winston said, his tone instantly shifting from aggressive mockery to highly respectful professional courtesy. "It is a distinct pleasure to see you again. I believe you are already intimately familiar with my lead senior associate, Julian." Every single head in the entire dining room, including my father's and Preston's, whipped around so fast they practically got whiplash to look at the billionaire real estate whale. Mr. Montgomery slowly stood up from his leather armchair. He methodically buttoned his suit jacket, his expression incredibly grim and severe. He looked at my father with utter contempt, then looked directly at me with profound respect. "I am very familiar," Montgomery said, his voice deep and commanding, cutting through the tension. "In fact, Harrison, when my corporation was facing a highly aggressive $70 million hostile takeover attempt last spring, I didn't hire your firm to consult. I hired Winston's firm, and the brilliant man who sat across the table from a room full of corporate sharks, the man who single-handedly restructured my hidden assets and saved my entire real estate empire from being aggressively liquidated." Montgomery paused for dramatic effect, gesturing respectfully and openly toward me. "Was your son Julian? He is without a doubt one of the most brilliant, ruthless, and highly compensated corporate attorneys I have ever had the pleasure of working with in my entire career. He is absolutely no paralegal, Harrison. He is a legal sniper, and you treat him like absolute garbage." The collective gasp from the 35 guests this time was deafening. It was the sound of an entire social hierarchy collapsing in real time. My father looked at me, his eyes wide with sheer terror, his jaw actually dropping open. The horrific realization hit him like a runaway freight train. The quiet son he had ignored for decades, the son he had constantly belittled, the son he had just physically assaulted in front of witnesses, was a high-powered Manhattan attorney who literally held the keys to his biggest investor's empire. "Julian," my father stammered, his voice suddenly weak, pathetic, and barely audible. You're a lawyer? You never said." "I'm a senior associate up for junior partner next month, Dad," I said, my voice ice-cold, devoid of any sympathy. "I routinely negotiate $30 million corporate settlements before you even finish your morning coffee. I didn't tell you because you never actually cared enough about my life to ask. And when I did try to tell you about my successes years ago, you laughed in my face to protect Preston's fragile ego." But Mr. Winston wasn't finished. The brutal execution was only halfway through. "Now," Winston said, turning his predatory, unforgiving gaze back to my older brother, who was actively sweating profusely through his expensive velvet jacket, "let's finally address Preston's desperate, manic need for the liquid capital from the Cape Cod property. You see, Theodore didn't just hire my firm to draft his final will. He formally appointed me as the primary legal trustee for Preston's heavily restricted trust fund." Preston's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated terror. He took a stumbling step backward. "Shut up," Preston hissed, spittle flying from his lips. Don't you dare say another word. You have strict client confidentiality. You can't disclose that. You are a trust beneficiary, Preston. You are absolutely not my client, Winston corrected smoothly, pulling one final, razor-thin folder from his leather briefcase. As the legal trustee, I have full, unmitigated legal access to your comprehensive financial background checks to ensure the integrity of the trust isn't compromised by criminal activity. And the deep background check I ran last week was absolutely fascinating reading. Winston looked slowly around the room, making absolutely sure every single investor and politician was listening closely to every word. Preston, Winston announced loudly, is currently carrying over $600,000 in highly illegal, offshore gambling debts. He owes this massive sum to highly unsavory, completely unregulated lenders who charge aggressive loan shark interest rates. That brand new, silver Porsche currently parked in the driveway? It is heavily leveraged against a predatory, high-interest title loan that is currently 3 months past due for payment. Preston is completely, utterly, and hopelessly bankrupt. The absolute only reason he is desperately trying to steal his younger brother's rightful inheritance tonight is so he can immediately liquidate the Cape Cod house at a massive loss and pay off his violent bookies before they literally break his legs. My mother let out a horrific, high-pitched scream of pure agony and physically collapsed into a dining chair, burying her face in the tablecloth. My father stood frozen, staring at his golden child, the son he had worshipped blindly, the son he had built his entire legacy and identity around. Preston, my father whispered, his voice cracking with utter devastation. $600,000? The business? Tell me you didn't use the company accounts. Tell me. I was going to win it all back, Dad. Preston screamed hysterically, tears actually streaming down his red face as his entire manufactured, fraudulent life imploded spectacularly in front of the city's absolute elite. I just needed the house. If Julian just gave me the damn house, I could fix it. I could pay them back. It's his fault for being so incredibly selfish. He was a 32-year-old grown man, standing in a custom velvet tuxedo, sobbing uncontrollably and blaming his younger brother for his own crippling gambling addiction and criminal debt. It was the most pathetic, repulsive thing I had ever witnessed in my entire life. I thought the worst was over, but the fallout was about to drag them straight to hell. The immediate, brutal aftermath of Winston's devastating legal revelations was exactly like watching a horrific, slow-motion car crash on the highway. You couldn't look away, even as the destruction unfolded. The pristine, highly controlled, meticulously curated environment of my parents' elite Christmas dinner had completely devolved into absolute, chaotic horror. The wealthy guests didn't just sit there in stunned, polite silence anymore. The powerful spell of the Sinclair family legacy was completely and permanently broken. In the ruthless, highly judgmental, and incredibly fickle world of suburban high society, there are two absolute, unforgivable sins you can commit: public, unhinged violence against your own family members and massive, scandalous financial insolvency. My father and my older brother had just spectacularly committed both of those sins on a massive scale, live and in person, in front of the exact people they desperately needed to survive in the business world. Mr. Montgomery was the very first person to move. He didn't say a single word to the room at large. He simply reached over, picked up his wife's incredibly expensive cashmere winter coat from the back of her dining chair, gently helped her into it, and turned toward the grand foyer. My father panicked entirely. He practically shoved past my violently sobbing mother to intercept the billionaire before he could reach the heavy oak front door. "Arthur, please wait," my father begged, his voice pitching high and desperate, completely stripping away any remaining shred of his pride and dignity. "This is just a minor, embarrassing family misunderstanding. My son is unwell. The downtown redevelopment project is still completely secure. We are fully prepared to break ground next month as planned. You have my absolute word on it." Mr. Montgomery stopped in his tracks. He slowly turned and looked at my father with eyes so incredibly cold and unforgiving they could have frozen the Atlantic Ocean. "Harrison," Montgomery said, his voice low, steady, and intentionally loud enough for every single remaining guest in the room to hear with crystal clarity. I built my entire real estate empire from the ground up by partnering strictly with men of integrity and vision. You just physically assaulted your own son over a piece of real estate. Your chosen heir is drowning in illegal gambling debt and lying directly to your face about your company's finances. Your entire corporate structure is a fragile house of cards just waiting for a stiff breeze to knock it down. If you think for 1 second I would trust you with a single dime of my capital after witnessing this absolute circus, you are infinitely more delusional than you claimed your father was. Montgomery stepped smoothly around my father, refusing to even look at him again. My corporate lawyers will be sending the formal contract termination notices via courier on Monday morning. Do not ever attempt to contact my office again. With that devastating final sentence, the billionaire walked out the front door, leaving it wide open to the freezing, biting winter air. That was the absolute, undeniable death blow. The social and financial dominoes fell immediately and rapidly. Seeing the biggest, most influential whale in the city completely and publicly sever ties with the Sinclair family, the rest of the wealthy guests scrambled in a sheer panic to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout. Local politicians, who had been laughing at Preston's jokes just an hour ago, suddenly remembered urgent, late-night phone calls they absolutely had to take. Corporate real estate investors aggressively grabbed their wives by the arms and practically ran for the coat check. The senior country club board members exchanged horrified, deeply disgusted whispers as they filed quickly out into the cold night, already plotting my father's removal from the board. The hired valets in the driveway were completely overwhelmed as 35 elite guests angrily demanded their luxury cars all at once, desperate to flee the scene of the scandal. Within exactly 15 agonizing minutes, the massive, glowing 8,000-square-foot house was completely, hauntingly empty of guests. The only people left in the sprawling, silent dining room were the hired catering staff, who were awkwardly and silently staring at the floor, desperately wishing they were invisible, and my completely shattered, ruined biological family. My mother was violently slumped over in her dining chair, her expensive mascara running in dark streaks down her pale face, staring blankly at the cold, untouched filet mignon on her plate. Preston was sitting on the hardwood floor by the roaring fireplace, his head buried deep in his hands, rocking slightly back and forth, muttering incoherently to himself. My father stood completely alone in the exact center of the room, looking around at the empty, pulled-out chairs. The entire real estate empire and social standing he had spent 30 ruthless years building through manipulation, bullying, and false appearances had been completely vaporized into thin air in less than 20 minutes. He slowly looked at Mr. Winston, who was calmly, methodically packing his medical documents and tablets back into his slim leather briefcase. Then Harrison slowly turned his defeated gaze to me. The fiery, narcissistic anger was completely gone from his eyes. The uncontrollable rage had entirely burned out, leaving absolutely nothing behind but sheer, pathetic, animalistic panic. "Julian," my father croaked, his voice entirely broken. He took a hesitant, trembling step toward me. He raised his hands in a weak, pathetic gesture of surrender. "Julian, please, you have to help us. You know Arthur Montgomery personally. You're his lead lawyer. You can talk to him. You can explain that this was all just a terrible, emotional misunderstanding. If he pulls his massive funding, the bank is going to immediately call in all of the commercial loans on the business. We will lose the entire company. We will lose this house. We will be out on the street." I looked at the broken man standing in front of me. This was the exact same man who, just 30 short minutes ago, had violently dug his fingernails into my arm and explicitly threatened to destroy my entire life and career if I didn't obey his commands. Now, he was literally begging me for his financial salvation. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I slowly reached up with my right hand and unbuttoned the cuff of my left tuxedo sleeve. I meticulously rolled up the crisp white fabric of my expensive dress shirt, fully exposing my left bicep to the bright chandelier light. Right there, stark, ugly, and undeniable against my pale skin, were 4 deep, dark purple, crescent-shaped bruises where his fingernails had brutally bitten into my flesh. I held my arm up high, forcing him to look directly at the physical damage he had just inflicted on his own son. "Do you see this, Harrison?" I asked, my voice completely devoid of any emotion whatsoever. I didn't feel angry anymore. I didn't feel sad or betrayed. I just felt completely, wonderfully, overwhelmingly detached from these people. This is your true legacy. This is what you do to people who don't perfectly fit into your manufactured, controllable narrative. You hurt them until they comply. He stared at the dark bruises on my arm, his mouth opening and closing silently like a fish out of water, entirely unable to form a single coherent word in his defense. I am setting a hard, unbreachable, absolute legal boundary right here, right now in front of witnesses, I told him, dropping my arm and methodically rolling my sleeve back down to cover the assault marks. I am keeping the Cape Cod estate. It belongs entirely to me as Theodore wished. If Preston, or if anyone else in this deeply toxic family ever attempts to contact me, call my firm, or step foot anywhere near my property, I will immediately file a formal police report for assault and battery. I have 35 highly credible witnesses and an elite Manhattan attorney who saw you do it. I will drag you kicking and screaming through criminal court, and I will personally make sure you spend time in a jail cell. My mother let out a fresh, piercing wail of absolute despair from her chair, but I ignored her completely. She had made her choice when she told me I was no longer her son. "Have a Merry Christmas, Harrison," I said softly. I turned around, picked up my heavy winter coat from the back of the chair, and walked out the front door alongside Mr. Winston. The freezing, biting winter air hit my face the second I stepped outside, and for the very first time in 29 years, I could finally take a deep, full, unrestricted breath. Exactly 1 year later, the world looked completely and fundamentally different. The following March, I was officially and unanimously promoted to junior partner at Winston & Associates. The prestigious announcement was made in the firm's main glass-walled conference room, complete with expensive champagne and genuine applause from my respected colleagues. Gregory, the arrogant nepotism hire who had foolishly tried to threaten my career with baseless rumors about elder abuse, was noticeably absent from the celebration. He had quietly and embarrassingly resigned 2 weeks prior, right after his billable hours dropped to historic, embarrassing lows and the senior partners finally realized he was functionally useless in a real courtroom setting. I moved my belongings into a massive, beautiful corner office with a stunning, unobstructed view of Central Park, completely free from the suffocating shadows of my past. As for my biological family, the severe consequences of that fateful, disastrous Christmas dinner were swift, brutal, and utterly devastating. Without Mr. Montgomery's crucial capital investment to keep the sinking ship afloat, the regional bank aggressively and immediately called in all of the outstanding commercial loans on my father's real estate company. Harrison was legally forced to file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy by the end of the summer. The massive 8,000-square-foot colonial estate where I grew up, the fortress of their manufactured superiority, was quietly sold at a deep, embarrassing discount to a rival developer just to cover the immediate, crushing corporate debts. Preston's life collapsed entirely under the weight of his own lies. The predatory, high-interest lenders aggressively repossessed his silver Porsche directly from the driveway of his suburban home in the middle of the night. His wife, Diana, completely disgusted by the sheer magnitude of his secret gambling addiction and utterly terrified by the sudden lack of luxury and financial security, immediately filed for divorce and successfully sought full legal custody of their children. The last I heard through the remaining, fractured family grapevine, Preston was living in a modest, dingy one-bedroom apartment across town and had finally been forced by a judge to check himself into an intensive outpatient rehab facility for his severe gambling addiction. I didn't gloat about their absolute ruin. I didn't celebrate their incredibly steep downfall. I just simply didn't care anymore. They were complete strangers to me now, ghosts from a past life I had successfully escaped. But there was one final, deeply shocking twist to the entire saga that I didn't see coming. In late November, just a few weeks before Thanksgiving, I received a thick, handwritten letter in the mail at my New York office. The return address on the envelope was a modest, rented townhouse in a completely different, much lower-income zip code. I recognized the frantic handwriting instantly. It was from my mother, Margaret. I stood by my desk, holding the letter, and almost threw it directly into the heavy-duty paper shredder, fiercely honoring my own strict, uncompromising no-contact boundary. But a morbid, lingering curiosity got the better of me. I carefully sliced the envelope open. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't an angry, entitled demand for financial support. It was a complete, devastating, multi-page confession. In the tear-stained letter, Margaret admitted that the total financial ruin of the family wasn't just Preston's fault, and it wasn't just my father's overwhelming arrogance. She confessed that for the last 5 years, she had been secretly and systematically embezzling money from my father's personal retirement accounts and the company's emergency cash reserves. She had secretly taken out a second mortgage on the colonial house. She had been quietly funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars directly to Preston to cover his earlier, smaller gambling debts, desperately trying to protect the flawless image of her perfect golden child from my father's inevitable, explosive wrath. She was the one who had completely drained the family's financial safety net. She was the one who had fundamentally weakened the company's liquidity long before Mr. Montgomery officially pulled his funding. She wrote that the crushing guilt of watching the empire completely collapse, knowing she had actively handed Preston the financial shovels to dig his own grave, was eating her alive every single day. She begged for my forgiveness. She asked, with deep desperation, if we could just meet for a quick cup of coffee in the city, just to talk and try to heal. I read the long letter twice, absorbing the sheer magnitude of her deception. I didn't feel a sudden surge of anger. I just felt a profound, overwhelming sense of pity for a deeply flawed woman who had completely destroyed her entire life, her marriage, and her family, just to maintain the toxic illusion of a perfect golden child. I took the letter, placed it firmly into my shredder, and watched the sharp metal blades turn her desperate confession into meaningless confetti. I didn't reply to the letter. I didn't call her. I maintained my absolute, uncompromising boundary. Forgiveness doesn't mean granting someone immediate re-entry into your peaceful life so they can infect you with their chaos and toxicity all over again. True healing sometimes means walking away and never, ever looking back, no matter how much they beg. This past Christmas, I didn't spend the holiday sitting at the dark, isolated end of a long mahogany table, surrounded by arrogant strangers and abusive relatives. Instead, I proudly hosted Christmas at the Cape Cod estate. My house. I had spent the entire year carefully renovating the beautiful old colonial, painting the walls bright colors, updating the massive kitchen, but keeping Grandfather Theodore's favorite study exactly the way he left it. It still smelled faintly of his old books and sweet pipe tobacco. The house was incredibly warm, brightly lit, and filled with genuine, unrestricted laughter. I invited my best friend and colleague, Clara, who brought her new fiancé. Mr. Winston attended, completely leaving his intimidating, ruthless lawyer persona back in Manhattan, relaxing comfortably by the roaring fire with a glass of good, aged bourbon. A few other close, supportive friends from law school drove up to spend the long holiday weekend. We cooked a massive, messy dinner together in the kitchen. Nobody wore a stiff tuxedo or an uncomfortable evening gown. Nobody bragged aggressively about commercial real estate yields or offshore bank accounts. We just sat around the heavy wooden table in the dining room, eating amazing food, drinking good wine, and listening to the rhythmic sound of the waves crashing against the cliffs just outside the window. After dinner, I stepped out onto the back porch alone. The winter air was freezing, biting sharply at my cheeks, but it felt incredibly clean, pure, and invigorating. I looked out over the vast, dark expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, the bright moonlight reflecting beautifully off the churning water. I thought about Grandfather Theodore. I thought about the incredible, life-changing gift he had given me. It wasn't just a $2.8 million house. He had given me the ultimate legal weapon to permanently free myself from a lifetime of severe emotional abuse. He had given me the final, necessary push I needed to fully realize my own undeniable worth in this world. They tell you constantly that blood is thicker than water. They tell you that you owe your biological family absolutely everything, no matter how terribly they treat you, simply because you share a genetic code. It is the greatest, most toxic lie we are consistently sold in our society. Family is absolutely not defined by blood. Family is defined by mutual respect, by unwavering support, and by the people who choose to stand with you and fight for you when you are at your absolute lowest point. I didn't lose a family that night at the disastrous Christmas dinner. I successfully, surgically excised a deadly cancer from my life. And in the massive, peaceful, empty space they left behind, I built a beautiful, fulfilling life filled with people who actually value me for exactly who I am. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to my story tonight. Have you ever faced something incredibly similar with your own toxic family members? Have you ever had to draw a hard, unforgiving line in the sand and walk away from the people who were supposed to love you the most? Please, share your story in the comments below, and don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next journey. Stay strong, always know your true worth, and never, ever let anyone make you feel like a footnote in your own incredible life.